It's our immense pleasure today to welcome Sir Leszek Borysiewicz to give some opening remarks about GapSummit. So Sir Boris is the chair of Cancer Research UK, and he's seen GapSummit since its inception in 2014. So without further ado, please give a warm welcome to Sir Boris.
Thanks very much indeed. Look, it's a real privilege and pleasure to actually be asked to open this conference. I have two daughters, both in academia, and they usually say, God, Dad, you're really getting old when they're asking you to give the opening addresses. So I promise I won't keep you very long, because I think I've seen where they've having the opening reception. It looks great, and I don't want to keep you for very long from that. But the pleasure is really very much based on the fact that I've had the privilege of engaging with the GapSummit really since its inception. And what was unique about the GapSummit from the outset is the fact that this was driven by young investigators, by young entrepreneurs and others. This doesn't come top down from great ideas coming down and moving. This was if you like, a grassroots movement, a movement which was inspired with the words that are on your website, to lead. That you're not frightened of leadership, that you want to take that leadership position to move things forward. You want to innovate, you want to change, you don't want to have the accepted status quo, and you want to grow, because through growth there was the opportunity for real advancement. Now look, if you're Vice Chancellor, any group that comes to see you and says those are the 3 targets that we really want to hit, it's going to attract your attention. And the GapSummit did in 2014 and has ever since. Now, I like the title, GapSummit, because the truth is whatever we see in the advances in technology, and yep, we're in a global biotech revolution, no getting away from it. But the trouble is with every revolution, we leave people behind. In my own world, which was very much geared towards healthcare, I had the privilege of spending in the former department of DFID, chairing the advisory committee to the department on where research should be focused in the world's poorest 30 countries. I've had the privilege also of working in one of those countries, not as an academic, but just as a practicing clinician. But you can't help observing the dynamic of what goes on in poorer countries, which are mostly agrarian in terms of the local microeconomic environment that people find themselves in. To me, it's an unholy triad that I observed. There's the economic situation that every household faced and faces in such communities. And it's mostly about productivity. It's can you produce enough food, bearing in mind the climate and other issues that are hitting your crop? Because it's through that you can then begin to educate your family. Similarly, if the crops are failing and you've got low yields, you pull your family out of education in order to maximize the yields you're going to be able to get from the land or elsewhere. And if you can't produce the food, you can't produce the wealth, the impact on the health of the family is pretty instantaneous. And if you've got poor health, you ain't going to get much education done through that area. So for me, it's always been this triad, which is like a positive, really one of these awful biological positive feedback loops that once you get into, if you can't break into that circle of the economy, education, and healthcare, you are in real trouble, because at the end of the day, the negative factors continually reinforce that position. So in looking at your agenda for the summit, I began to think a little about what the challenges I would like to ask you to look at as the few days progresses. You've got fantastic speakers. Challenge them. They really are leaders in their areas. Challenge them. Make sure the questions really go to the heart of what you're about. Now you focus on 3 areas. Biosphere, great area to focus on, hugely important to this agenda. But are we already over-exploiting the biosphere that's actually available to us? What about when we start looking at the diversity that we've actually got in the plant and animal kingdoms? You know, when you look at agriculture at the present time, there are 6 agricultural crops that keep the world alive. You wouldn't think on an evolutionary scale, that's a very comfortable place to be. How do we begin to exploit new crops and actually ensure that we can use the technologies to bolster up the problems that will arise from climate change, the problems that will arise from plant diseases and elsewhere? But it's got a further problem. Who's benefiting at the present time from the exploitation of the biosphere? It's certainly not the developing countries. There was a report published about 20 years ago. It was published by the inter-academies. That's places like the Royal Societies around the world and equivalent organizations. And they get together periodically to produce a report. And they asked about the place of, using their terminology, of the global south. And they came to one conclusion. Where does the intellectual property reside for issues and discoveries that come from universities in sub-Saharan Africa or in poorer parts of the world? They're inevitably sponsored by major corporations coming from outside, and you all work in the real world. You know that the intellectual property will not necessarily remain in the country where those discoveries or those questions have been raised, but will actually be pulled out in order to benefit the economy of North America, Europe, and the richer parts of the world. And the challenge that was posed in that report is, how do we enable a global revolution in the biosphere, but also ensure that the poorest are able to benefit by having and maintaining their own intellectual property to develop their own industries and their own workforce to exploit this? I think it's a really difficult challenge. It's a very difficult one. But if we don't solve it, it's going to be a real problem going forward. The second area is your social sphere. Now, this really does matter, because you can take a horse to water, you can't make him drink it. And we've got real problems with the social sphere. Some of it is pretty apparent in healthcare. How on earth do you deal with the challenge of Nigeria, northern Nigeria in particular, not wishing to have the poliovirus vaccine because it actually felt that this was in some way impacting negatively on fertility, or in the vaccines I've been involved in, human papillomavirus vaccines, where it's so difficult to convince communities that this is really protective of women in their society. Those are problems of education. Those are problems of being able to ensure that people are informed, not with a bias or a political agenda, but actually being able to be educated such that they can make up their own mind and look at the evidence for themselves and be able to potentially exploit that evidence for the well-being of their community and their families. And therefore, we are now going to be creating yet a further inequality. Just ponder for a moment, in the world that many of you are involved in with artificial intelligence, machine learning, the access to computers, access to data, and you'll be debating this. But just think for a moment, in the whole history of mankind, has illiteracy ever been a greater division point for societies as a whole? If you cannot read or write, how on earth are you going to take advantage of a medium which provides information, and yet it's incredibly difficult to do that? And particularly, I'm going to wear my heart on my sleeve, it's the education of girls. When you've been in the field and you've experienced girls getting married off at the age of 9, potentially coming in pregnant at 12 or 13, it really beggars the question, where is the education? Can we keep girls in education to 13 or 14 in those countries to ensure that they can build their own well-being? Because we know if we educate girls, actually all healthcare and public health interventions have a far greater chance of success. and of ensuring that economic resources in a family group are used effectively for the benefit of the whole family. And then last, access to information technology. It's a brilliant world that we're facing. I think, the opportunities that AI, possibly more than machine learning in the area of biology, is bringing to the fore, completely novel concepts, challenging accepted dogma. It's a brilliant study that carried out about 4 years ago on, my world, cancer, of the classification of brain tumors. When computers began to look at the histology of brain tumors, they said they tended to agree with the pathologist's diagnosis in 60% of cases. And whenever there was a discrepancy, and it was only a 5 or 10% discrepancy that actually occurred, it was the computer that tended to be right. But more importantly, what we learned from that was that in the other 30% of cases, what the computer said is, your classification is all to hell, because it looked very differently at how you might classify diseases. Now, that study was done in glioblastoma, where, in all honesty, that is not going to impact on clinical practice. But just ponder that that could impact on clinical practice. And again, in the countries that need it most, are they going to have access to this technology? And are they going to have the workforce that is actually capable of taking advantage of that technology, of your discoveries, for the benefit of those societies where the need is going to be greatest in the next 20 to 30 years? So I'm sorry if I sound like some sort of messiah pleading for the poor of the world, but I do actually passionately believe that we have to solve these problems, or we will be experiencing them on our own doorstep. So as you go through these few days, let me challenge you. Stop thinking of how many papers in Nature you will receive, or whether the next great discovery is going to buy you the next biggest lodge that you could have, or how many Porsches you might want in your drive, or whatever else you may wish to do with the gains you rightly achieve by the discoveries and innovation that you pose. But ask yourself and ask the speakers the question, what is going to be the global impact of the innovations you will strive to achieve? And not just the impact on individuals, but the impact on the society that we would want to build. And that is the billion-dollar question. Because actually, if we have a safe and secure society built on a more equitable distribution of benefits, then there's every chance we might all live to enjoy the future without some of the tribulations that the world is facing today. So my apologies for that. Those are my personal thoughts, my personal views. They are deeply held. They've been held for a long time. And if you think inequalities are new, let me just ask you, for the health inequalities in the United Kingdom were all identified in a report which I read as an undergraduate student, published by Lord Black, then President of the Royal College of Physicians, in 1972. They were all identified then. They were re-reviewed, and there's a Penguin paperback of that review available if you're interested in it, in 1993. And the impact of any change that was introduced onto those inequalities was zero. And Michael Marmot has just very recently published an update on the impact of inequalities on health in a country as developed as the United Kingdom. And have we closed the gap? No, we haven't. So please, over these 3 days, don't just reiterate the problems, because we're great as scientists and technologists of reiterating and restating the problem, but challenge the speakers and challenge the panels as to how they believe that they can drive this impact to the benefit of the many, not the few. I'm sorry, that doesn't mean to be a political slogan at all. So don't let me hold you up. I look forward to having maybe a chat with some of you over a glass of wine. I hope that we would be able to have. May I wish you every success for what promises to be a fantastic meeting. I would wish to be here with you. Unfortunately, I'm going to be on a flight tomorrow. Not very good for my carbon background, but I will be. And I will be watching online and hoping to participate in some way during some free time that I do have. But I envy you in what looks to be a great conference coming forward. So thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to address.